Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce the Reverend Dr. Patrick Richmond to you. He is Vicar of Christ Church, Eton. He has a degree in physiology from Oxford and a DPhil in cell physiology from Oxford. Following that, he worked in Pakistan with drug addicts, and then came to Wycliffe, and we were contemporaries at Wycliffe. He is rather younger than I am, but we were exact contemporaries doing the same course at Wycliffe for training for ordination and doing the BA in theology. After that, Patrick did a curacy in Leicester and then came to Cambridge as chaplain and dean of St Catherine's College before taking up his present post in 2007. So it's a great joy to have you with us, Patrick. I look forward to your talk.
It's a great joy to be back and to see Rodney, and in many ways I feel I'm a contemporary of his but following in his footsteps, and Rodney has parochial experience and greater expertise in science and religion, but I'm honoured to be here and talking to you about this question that Rodney has set me. Now, the question of handling the questions in the parish might raise the question, well, which parish? And it does depend a lot. So I want to emphasise that this is highly anecdotal and personal. I'm going to be speaking from my own experience, which hasn't been scientifically studied in any way whatsoever. But I hope that it is at least one little case study of some experience of someone with an interest in science and religion out there at the cold face, so to speak. I wasn't taught this at theological college, so I think it's great that you're being offered this opportunity, because though obviously I'm not unbiased, I think it's an important question, increasingly important, and so the fact that you've got an opportunity to study it in this circumstance, I think, is going to put you in better stead than I was when I was sent out into the wild. Now obviously I'm teaching grandma to suck eggs here. You need to tailor your material to your audience and not just your hobby horse. So I don't know if any of you do have a particular interest in this. As you can probably guess, I did, coming from a scientific background, being friendly with Rodney, it was doomed that I would be interested in this. Whenever we do things in the parish, we need to be thinking, do we believe this and do we have integrity presenting it? But even more importantly, are we doing this for the sake of the congregation, the people we're ministering to, the people we're meeting? We're not just serving ourselves. So, depending on which parish you end up in, handling the questions of science and religion needs to be tailored to that. Again, science is a moving field. It has a body of knowledge that's always growing, and as I moved from Cambridge into the parish, there was a question how I was going to stay in touch, how I'd stay current, how could I remain informed enough to be pulled back by Rodney to give a talk to you, for example. And I want to emphasise, this is probably again utterly obvious, but the internet is so important. There are things freely available there, including multimedia from the Faraday Institute, but from many other organisations, some of them atheistic, some of them Christian, some of them in between, that put at your fingertips, at your mouse tip, information that's current and often better presented than anything you would be able to generate yourself, or I would be able to generate myself. So do use all the opportunities that Cambridge provides to give you skills to handle the internet and access the reliable information. Journals. Rodney is of course involved in science and Christian belief, and there are some other journals that will keep you in touch, and I read these things. Groups and societies. Sometimes there are organisations like Christians and Science. I'm now the secretary of Norfolk Science and Faith Group, and we organise lectures in the cathedral. And just anecdotally, my impression is that often in the science religion field there are people who are very skilled in science, but they're not perhaps so informed about the theology and the philosophy. And it's a multidisciplinary field, and people like yourselves who've got some theological background can have a real yeast effect, helping the discussion of science and religion grow rather than remain rather leaden. You'll be talking a bit later, I think, about test of faith materials. We've had those in our parish. They were discovered quite independently of me and have been out there. That's another thing you'll find, that you can't control the flow of information once you're out there. And also, I think you've been talking about environmental aspects and stewardship. I think this is very current and real, and my own diocese, Norwich, has an environmental policy and links to the UEA, which has been generating a lot of publicity for itself. There's no such thing as bad publicity, we all know. So I'm sure you'll find that that is on the menu and available quite easily. But the stuff I'm going to be talking to you about is perhaps a bit more rarefied. But as I've said, tackling the different audiences requires different approaches. But I've found that you find a range of congregations. I have an 8 o'clock, who are not the youngest group. I've also been invited to give talks to the University of the Third Age, people who've got a lot of time and enjoy discussing. And obviously, I've had to take into account that I'm not dealing with a congregation there, and that's rather fun. I like the opportunity to reach out, and science, religion, dialogue, and related topics has purchase out there. It's of general interest, and it's quite nice to be generally interesting. Obviously, depending on where you end up, if you're in Cambridge in a parish or equivalent, or if you're in a UPA, that's going to affect what you encounter. When I was in Leicester, it was a different situation, certainly from Norwich. Schools. This has been a huge opportunity and a huge challenge. I've got a lot of schools in my parish, and issues of science obviously right up there. And I've found 6-year-olds asking questions that, who made God? Or, if you were eaten by a fish, you'd be dead. So even from an early age, the critical questions are there. And my own daughters are asking me questions which I would interpret as questions about the genre of the biblical writing, ranging from, are these fairy tales, and more sophisticated ways of putting the same question. And of course, a range of different theological emphases. I was aware as a student that often quite conservative evangelical churches had a lot of scientists and medics in them. And so, depending on the theological complexion that your congregation and you have, that will affect how these questions present themselves. I'll say a bit more about that. But obviously, if you have a more evangelical and Bible-centered spirituality, then questions about how the Bible can be reconciled with our latest scientific understanding are going to be more to the fore. So it affects where the problems are felt most keenly, and affects what people tend to ask you about after a sermon, for example, or when a news story breaks and Hawking discovers that there's no beginning to the universe requiring blue touch paper or something. And of course, we need to be practical. How much time have you got available? If you start a hare running, are you just raising a question that is going to bother people without being able to give them the answers? And of course, we may not be able to give them the answers. In a sermon, a sound bite is very valuable because it gets the slogan out there quickly. In a seminar, I hope there's more opportunity for discussion. And perhaps at this point, as we move into the more substantial parts of my talk, if anybody wants to ask a question of clarification at this point, that's great. It will add spice. It will give a rest to my voice as I've got a cold. But if it's a more significant exchange that you want, well, we're going to have a time for discussion, and I want to keep moving. I think Zoe's taking a film of us. So I've got a question of clarification already.
Sorry. No, it's just as you go along in the session, it would help if the acronyms and stuff like that, if you could explain them, because we're not all so akin to all of them.
Yeah, U3A, University of the Third Age. I didn't know about it much, but pensioners lifelong education, UPA urban priority areas. The educational levels in those will tend not to be so high. But keep calling me on this. I've become a school governor, and acronyms just fly. So, questions of science and religion in the parish. What questions? Well, you could get any and every question. And you might raise some of those questions, but they do get raised and come to you. And obviously the media, I think, is key. The power of the media shouldn't be underestimated. And even with Vince Cable, we're unlikely to be able to control it. And as you may already have come across, the conflict thesis that science and religion are in perpetual war to the death, and of course religion is going to lose that. That makes for a good story, makes for good copy, good journalistic writing and telly. And so I think that is still very much the atmosphere that we're speaking and preaching and discussing in. And the influence of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins. My PCC did a little sketch at our annual meeting where it became clear that the vicar's obsession with Richard Dawkins had been noted. But again, I have had many parishioners, more than 12 people independently, saying to me how much they enjoyed the God delusion, saying, if only I'd spoken to you about this before. I know clergy, there are, depending on the parish you end up in, there may be pockets of retired clergy, if you're somewhere near Oxford or Cambridge. So there are whole farms of retired clergy, but they may well be reading this stuff and the scales fall from their eyes as they realise how deluded they've been. So this stuff really is out there and making an impact. And I would say that apologetic questions are to the fore. People may be wondering, what on earth is the importance of this? Isn't this just an intellectual exercise? But the truth of the faith is at stake. We need to give a reason for why we are hanging in there with religious forms of life. And I think the new atheists, the media, and your own parish will be wanting you to answer the hard questions and giving them a reason to go on and remain faithful. But that doesn't mean we always need to be on the defensive. There are aspects, some of which I hope to show you, where science can give us a new angle on what we've been saying before. And popularisation. I may already be failing at this and not explain my acronyms, but we need to be able to communicate just as Dawkins and Hitchens have, in a way that people understand. And indeed, when I read The God Delusion, I thought how homiletic it is. Lovely stories, chatty, illustrations, all of that. I'm sure he got that from us first. but we have got a task to try and popularise and speak in a way that our congregation can understand, and not just those who've had a theological or a scientific education. And I've often wondered, and I think this is a general challenge, how far do you raise a question in your preaching that hasn't come to you already? Are you just creating problems? And I heard that the people preaching against essays and reviews in the 19th century, you may have heard of this, a collection of essays and reviews, the master of my old college was one of these contributors, and it shook the foundations of Victorian faith. But apparently most of these ideas got propagated by all the people who are answering them. Not so many people read essays and reviews, but many people heard people refuting it, and that's how the ideas got around. So this has been in my mind sometimes, and we can discuss how you want to tackle that particular issue. And also, when I've come here in the past, Rodney's asked me how my book on free will and predestination and the rest of it was coming. And to an extent, I've put it on the back burner because I've realised that people aren't that bothered about the question in the parish. When I was young, we used to stay up late into the night arguing about predestination and free will. There is scientific material out there that's highly relevant to this, but I just don't think it has much purchase. And a bit later I might talk about why questions about mind and body and free will perhaps don't have the same psychological weight in the wild, in the parish. So what am I going to be talking about substantially so that you can ask questions of clarification? Well, Genesis 1 to 11, I'll just touch on that. How and why questions, you've probably touched on this a bit already, and non-overlapping magisteria. Nativity and miracle stories coming off the back of Christmas. This has been real. Faith, reason and methodological naturalism, going a bit beyond the specific issues to how science is done and what sort of person is likely to find science congenial. Why there's almost certainly no God, perhaps I should have put that even higher. And science, religion, morality and psychology. So we shouldn't succumb to physics envy. There's plenty of science out there that's relevant, that's to do with humanity, and cognitive science of religion. My own hobby horse, riding it, but I've found it of relevance in the parish. So, when I was younger, I would have immediately thought that the science-religion question had a lot to do with 6 days of creation and Adam and Eve and the rest of it. And occasionally these passages will come up in the Church of England lectionary. I've actually found, talking at schools in assemblies, that primary school children take that as a pretty accurate representation of what we believe about creation. So if you are speaking to a young audience, certainly worth finding out whether they think God is an old man in the sky. I was surprised how many do. So we're not even talking about the details of the Yahwist and the Elohist traditions here. Noah's Ark, when I was a child, I had a younger brother, and it's part of our family law that on the bathroom wall there was a poster of George and the Dragon and Noah's Ark, and my brother sitting in the bath pointed to George and the Dragon and said, "That's an old wives' tale." And he pointed to Noah's Ark and said, "So's that." So when the Old Testament and the New Testament refer to these, I'm always conscious that there are severe scientific problems with them. They will come up in the course of preaching on the Bible. I think they're always in the background when you're talking about creation or harvest or things like that with school children. So, more generally, even beyond what might be termed sort of more evangelical Bible-focused congregations, I think in the background is always the question of the problem of evil. When I became a curate, I was told that a survey had been done of the congregation, and the problem of evil was the question that the congregation most wanted treating, and it was also what they wanted tackling for those outside the faith, and in terms of equipping them for apologetics and putting on apologetic chores. And of course, if we go for a scientifically informed reading of Genesis chapter 3 and Adam's fall, probably John Polkinghorne may have mentioned this to you, well, we're in a completely different ballgame. And yet, when I was a student, the curate taking our youth group was explaining evil in terms of Adam's fall. He knew that there were scientific problems with that, but he still trusted that. And I think increasingly we need to be aware of the problem of animal suffering. And did you have John Polkinghorne talk to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've come across in the wild, again in the parish, John Polkinghorne talking about a free process defence, that we can somehow help the problem of evil and suffering by saying that God has given freedom to the natural world to be itself. And I'm going to be controversial here. I think this is dangerous. And I've heard people like John Humphreys attacking it. And it's not hard to see that there's a problem. In fact, some of the Faraday material raises this problem, that while there may be some intuitive value in giving freedom and responsibility to an adult moral agent, we would restrict the freedom of an incompetent, a child or someone suffering from insanity. So how much more should we restrict the freedom of a mindless process? So I think I get people asking me about animal suffering increasingly, and of course that's relevant to the wider question of, even if you want to keep some sort of historical fall, how is that going to explain all the dinosaurs going extinct? Throw that out there. So then you may have tackled this and the different models for how science and religion interact. As I said, in short time scales, soundbites are useful, and it is useful, and I've heard a lot of eminent people talking about the distinction between how and why, and that we in the religious game are really worried about why and purpose and meaning, and science is worried about how. And this is often associated with Stephen Jay Gould and NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. Tackled by Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, and as Christmas has reminded us, it's not that straightforward. So recently my assistant priest preached on Matthew's nativity stories. He raised the question, so what sort of genetic code did Jesus have? But then he raised the question, well, what are these stories doing? And people were clearly interested, so I think in a relatively well-educated congregation, it goes quite well, and people wake up from their slumbers if you put out some of these questions. But it would be possible to reinterpret the stories completely non-historically, to say that they're making statements about the meaning and importance of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, that they're statements that should not be taken as being about how Jesus was born. They're more statements about why we should think Jesus is important. You will find in high-impact journals like Nature discussions of what the star was. As I said, you also need to be aware of your more theological and literary studies. Is this a credible historical story? They're both relevant. I'll come back to this, talking about methodological naturalism. So I think that the reality, and anecdotally, your congregation will spot that they don't only believe that things are important or have a purpose, they believe they're important and have a purpose because of how they came about. So the soundbite can bite back and leave you saying less about history than you might expect for a Christian theology. And theologies make factual claims about the natural world or history, certainly have done in the past. If we don't anymore, then we've changed the game quite considerably. There is scope for overlap, and there is scope for the conflicts that make the good copy. And more than that, science isn't just sitting there discussing how things are happening. It investigates religion and morality, so it's offering accounts of why people act as well. So there is an increasing scientific story which touches on why questions, meaning and purpose. Which leads me to another element. I think the new atheists are stressing reason. They see the real conflict is not so much between science and faith, but between faith and reason. Which is why I've suggested that you need to read some philosophy of religion, that the underlying questions are of that order, philosophical. So science isn't just a collection of claims or theories, it's a method for testing claims. It involves critical reasoning and evidence. And there are strains of religion which do seem to feel that criticism is doubt and that evidence is irrelevant. And science, of course, stresses empirical evidence, and that raises the question, well, what about the religious experience that many believers would claim is a basis and means that they're not just exercising blind faith? And I think we need to be thinking about the fact that our congregation are out there probably listening to us on a PA, just like we are here. Our congregation are increasingly using technology all the time. So science isn't just one method, it's a successful and revolutionary method that's really changing the way people have lived in the last 100 years. Not just one method amongst many. The way science can seem to take over things is based in the fact that science really is taking over things. So Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris and these new atheists are saying whether you're looking at the terrorists or the Amish, you're still dealing with something that's very dangerous, this attitude that's uncritical and unbased in evidence. So even moderate faith might make extremism more likely because it lacks the critical tools that weed out the dangerous ideas, which others will then spread. So it loosens the critical brakes on extremists and fanatics. Is everybody understanding what the challenge here is? So not just facts, it's about the whole way a scientist thinks. And the way scientists thinks, that's good, isn't it? And lying in the background, I think, is the question of methodological naturalism. Now, this isn't something that I would preach on under these terms, but I think it's part of the atmosphere that this discourse is going on in, this discussion. Basically, methodological naturalism means that as a principle about how you do science, you don't appeal to supernatural causes. And this would be explicit in discussions about creationism and intelligent design in the States, for example. Though if you look at Newton, he clearly did occasionally appeal to supernatural causes. But at some point it has become clearly orthodox scientific practice not to appeal to supernatural causes. So this is relevant to the God of the gaps. You've probably heard the term the God of the gaps. It would always be outside the scientific method to appeal to God to explain the gap. And there's a track record of closing those gaps. But it's not just that, it's that science now has a track record of solving problems by appealing to natural causes. So the origin of the universe, well, there's quite a lot of good scientific evidence that the universe had an origin. But is it fair then to explain that by God? If methodological naturalism is a scientific principle, then the scientist is not going to bring in God while there's any hope of a natural cause. And the existence of the multiverse as well. I'm speaking in the presence of an expert, but I think it's directly relevant. Is it scientific to appeal to all these other universes that we don't have direct access to when we've got the God explanation? Well, if methodological naturalism is a scientific principle, I think probably it is, because that's at least a natural explanation, and the supernatural one is ruled out methodologically by the way we do science. Am I making any sense? But I think this is also relevant to the historical criticism of the Bible, because the historians have been applying a similar sort of methodology, that you don't appeal to supernatural causes. So this isn't some arbitrary sellout, this is based on a very successful method. Well, is history of science? Well, there's a question. Talk about setting hairs running. But you've probably come across Trotz's principle of analogy. Speaking to Rodney, I'm now worried that this is all a myth. But it's a very common myth that historians do history critically by appealing to analogies of what we know happens. Well, I think that is all part of the same process. We look for natural causes, and we know that the vast majority of events have natural causes. So when, if ever, could we appeal to a supernatural one? And of course, the Hume-style arguments against the credibility of miracles. Is this familiar? David Hume argued that there's always a sound argument from experience against any miracle claim, because a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are established by as firm experiential support from what goes on as anything is. So what I think this means is that in the background are questions about how plausible is it ever to appeal to a miracle. And I think it's very plausible that given that most events aren't miraculous, and even some apparently miraculous events have turned out not to be miraculous, there's got to be some presumption in favour of the natural cause, at least initially. And so if we're going to offer an apologetic, we've got to tackle that. I think that is out there and people are feeling that. And if people are involved in science or history at some sort of academic level, they're probably explicitly aware of these issues. But I think everybody just spots, well, miracles, they don't happen very often. You know, the old thing about dead people don't rise, that's what's going on there. Anyway, all of that's an aside if there's no God. So, chapter 4 of the God Delusion is entitled, modestly enough, Why There Is Almost Certainly No God. So we can take comfort that Richard Dawkins isn't a complete atheist. And he also calls this the ultimate 747 gambit. Has everyone come across this? Great. Okay, well, I'm backing up the whole. So, I think Dawkins is popularising a problem that's out there, and what Dawkins would say is that an intelligent designer, for example, the Christian God, or any other God, or even a deist God, he would be even more complex and improbable than his creatures, which clearly need explanation. So that raises the question, well, who designed God? And I've been asked this by primary school children. Now, I suspect that they may be being put up to this. They've told their parents, we're going to the church today, or the vicar's coming to do an assembly, and their Dawkins reading father says, right, you ask him, who designed God then? That may well be happening, but it's happening more and more often, yeah.
Can I just say, as a primary school headmaster teacher of 36 years, that comes generally from children. They are little philosophers.
Yeah. So it's not just that their parents are putting them up to it. So the question is out there, and I get asked that. When I throw it open, I do get asked that question. But Dawkins' more sophisticated point is that God needs more explanation than he provides. But he can't have one. There's no evolutionary explanation of God, and an evolved God that's not what anybody in the traditional religions believes in. There's no other explanation available, is there? And what I've discovered is that this has been identified by a philosopher of the 19th century, Schopenhauer. It's called the taxi cab objection. Schopenhauer said that theists dismiss the need for explanation once they reach God, just like waving away a taxi when you've got to your destination. So we're saying, so who designed the world? Who explains the Big Bang? Why is there morality? We ask all these why questions, because religion's about why, not how questions, isn't it? Then we get to God and say, so why is God like he is? Why has he got those powers? Oh, no, we've reached God. It's a mystery. So Schopenhauer said that there's a double standard that operates. And I'm going to be provocative and say, I think he's got a point. So if we're going to tackle Dawkins' version of this taxi cab objection, that we have a double standard explaining the universe by God and not offering an explanation of God, what does Dawkins mean by complexity? Because it's not obvious that complexity requires an explanation. But he's talking about a very special sort of complexity which he calls organised complexity, like you found in animals, watches, and 747 jets. That's why he calls it the ultimate 747 gambit. So, if you look at the eye, all the different parts are arranged. They're very different parts, but in one particular way they function together to allow vision. Or the parts of a watch, very different parts, all arranged in one particular way, it'll tell the time and work. So there are many different parts specifically organised for function. The arrangement of the parts is improbable then, in the sense that there are many ways they could be arranged, but only a very narrow proportion of those is functional, does something useful, is any good, has any meaning to it. So Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, famously said that a hurricane blowing through a junkyard wouldn't assemble a 747 jet. And this has been used by apologists and creationists as an argument that there must be some sort of designer. The world or biology couldn't have come about just by chance processes, hurricanes in junkyards. So clearly we're not going to get a jumbo even close by chance. But Dawkins says, well, God is just the same, only worse. So human designers can explain organised complexity. This was the point made by William Paley, the famous archdeacon, who had written his natural theology that Darwin was impressed by. So there's some analogy between animals and products of human design, and if analogy between the things being explained, then there's an analogy between the explanation as well. So some sort of designer is suggested when we look at biology. Some sort of designer God. The watchmaker, hence the blind watchmaker, Dawkins' book. Dawkins is aware of David Hume's critique that God is no real help. And basically Philo, a sceptical character in Hume's dialogues, argues that order in the mind of a designer is just as much in need of explanation as order in the material world. In other words, it's a double standard to explain creatures by the designer God and not explain where the order in the divine mind comes from. And Dawkins endorses Hume to an extent, but he thinks that Hume underplayed just how much explanation is required for biological order. So Dawkins is worried that Hume doesn't seem to recognise that you really do need an explanation here. And Hume has explanations in terms of vast numbers and time, and he has explanation in terms of what can survive, but he never puts them together, he never gets Darwinism. But Dawkins is saying, well, God is unnecessary, because although you do need an explanation for biological order, we've got one. Praise be to Darwin. So Darwinism explains biological complexity. It's the blind watchmaker. Now that does leave the question, what explains evolution? Dawkins appeals to the fact that, well, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies in the known universe, and there could be trillions of universes, the multiverse. Well, that, of course, is speculative, but as I say, I think methodological naturalism points to that being the scientific way to go. Why is God complicated? Well, I think Dawkins is suggesting that all the intelligence we know has a complicated underlying structure to it. So brains are necessary for the consciousness that we find. So natural intelligence has a complicated correlate to it. And artificial intelligence, CPUs, central processing units, well, they're very complicated as well. So it looks plausible, doesn't it, that intelligence relies on some sort of hardware that's complicated to run it. I think that's quite crude. I'm surprised that Dawkins doesn't say more on this. But I think it's also plausible that in God's mind are these ideas, like Hume says. So I think that intuitively there's some problem that God's idea of the creation is just as improbable, as complicated and finely tuned as the creation itself. So you just push the problem further back, and you can't leave the taxi at this point on the quest, on the journey to an explanation. And then, of course, as well as God's idea of the real creation, he's got all the ideas of the possible creations. There's the chimera, made out of bits of animals. So you've got to explain where do all these divine ideas of possible creations come from? What explains the improbable arrangement of ideas in God's mind? Well, I think there is an answer. We can have an improbable arrangement without design. So the chance of getting a royal flush in a game of poker is, I'm told, extremely low if you're only dealt one hand. Okay? But if you were dealt unlimited hands, it'd be certain that it would contain a royal flush. So if we're saying that God is all-knowing, then he must know all possible arrangements. So there's no unexplained complexity in God because God doesn't require complex correlates of consciousness, a brain or CPU. That doesn't mean that God is unlike us, but I don't think anybody's really thought anything else when they seriously entertained God. God is not an embodied mind. And God's knowledge of creation can be explained in terms of his choice among the valuable possibilities. So it's not that we're offering God's knowledge of creation as an unexplained complex arrangement. And God's awareness of possibilities is unlimited, so it's not organised or selective. It's not that God has in his mind a narrow range of worthwhile, useful creations. It's that God's got in his mind all possible creations, and he chooses the valuable ones. So I think that we are able to offer some sort of explanation, and that God is not complicated in the way that organisms are, not anything like a brain or a CPU. So God's awareness of possibility shouldn't be seen as being made up of parts, shouldn't be seen as made up of separable ideas, that there's a sort of junkyard of ideas, the hurricane blows through it eternally and assembles God's mind. God's mind is nothing like an assemblage of parts. So I think that we should be saying, and bold to say, well, it looks as if God is a better explanation, a better stopping point than fundamental physics. So, in terms of methodological naturalism, when we've got to the most basic features of nature, there's still further explanatory work that could be done and can be done. So, fundamental physics is going to deal with very obscure ideas. You're going to have to do several degrees to understand what they're even talking about. It deals with lots of finite limits and values, very particular, even if we're dealing with a multiverse. It's going to raise the mind-body problem, how nature has subjective consciousness in some way intimately attached to it. And it's so complicated we don't even know what the final theory is. Whereas God, and it's probably going to be a composite multiverse, or maybe it is. But God is a familiar, intuitive idea. I'm going to say a bit more about this. God has no finite limits, or none that he hasn't chosen, thinking of the incarnation. There's a mind with no body, not thinking about the incarnation at this point. He's simple to specify. Even a child gets some idea once you've got over the problem that God looks a bit like a Michelangelo vicar. And God isn't composite, as I've been saying. No junkyards need apply. So I think we've got to be bold and have the courage of our convictions here and stand up. We're not just saying God doesn't have an explanation, we're saying God doesn't need an explanation. Well, Dawkins also raises the questions of morality. Now, I haven't got time to talk about this, obviously it would lead us far afield, but they do come up. Questions about abortion and stem cell debates certainly will arise in parish ministry. Our assistant priest, in fact, had an early experimental form of stem cell treatment. And I think the homosexuality debate, which we all know causes a certain amount of discussion in the church, well, it seems that scientific findings are directly relevant to that. We can discuss that later. But Dawkins is saying that the research evidence doesn't support the common view that religiosity is positively correlated with morality. So Dawkins is saying when you do a study, religious people aren't more moral. Well, in fact, I think that's an overstatement because there is very recent research that seems relevant to this question that is more positive. So again, I don't think we need to be totally defensive. So in this paper published in no less a journal than Science, those who frequently pray and attend religious services report more pro-social behaviour, such as charitable donations and volunteerism. 4 times more generous than secularists to all charities and 10% to non-religious charities. Give more blood, log more volunteer hours. So there is some evidence suggesting that religious practice and devotion makes a difference to social activity that builds communities. And in that paper, they suggest this effect seems to happen when it builds your positive image of yourself. So if you look good to others or you look good to yourself by doing a good deed, then you're more likely to do it. When we think people are watching, we behave better. Obviously that has some intuitive plausibility, doesn't it? Well, if the others include God, then you've got an additional person who might be present. So even when you're on your own, you're not. God's always watching. And when people are reminded of God, even when they don't believe in God, And even when it's a subconscious reminder, it seems to make a difference to their willingness to cooperate. Now, there are other things that have that effect. If you mention the police subliminally, people are more likely to cooperate as well. But it does seem that religious belief plausibly has a mechanism to make us behave better when we're conscious of it, or even subliminally conscious of it. And also, religious commitment seems to make us healthier and happier. So, blind you with science there, but I've given that reference to a book by a Christian psychologist, but he assembles a lot of the evidence that you'll be healthier, wealthier, and happier, well, roughly. So, the Social Capital Benchmark survey done in the United States also showed that religious people are more likely to favour banning books from libraries, more likely to be antipathetic to equal rights for immigrants, have lower levels of support for racial intermarriage, and lower levels of friendships with gays. So there is another side to that. Obviously this is in the United States, and the political divide will be relevant to this, but I think it's plausible, again anecdotally, but from my experience in the parish, that there is a strong community ethic which can become tribal. So religious differences, we all are sadly aware, often coincide with deep cultural and political differences, think Northern Ireland. And psychologists have examined quite independently of religion that humans like being part of groups, and they're biased to see those who are outside the group as all the same and as competitors. So you get competing tribes, if you like. And even arbitrary groupings can cause competition, conflict and tribalism. So I remember running a wide game as a curate. I divided the children up into the Sith and the Jedi totally randomly, and they were soon chanting about the inferiorities of the others and how they were going to rule. So randomly assigning children different coloured clothes caused them to group and exclude outsiders. But the Old Testament enjoins care for the stranger and the alien, something that Dawkins and Hitchens downplay and seem to misunderstand. Hitchens didn't seem in a debate to understand that the Good Samaritan was actually about love for the stranger and the enemy. And social psychological investigation suggests that believers who are committed to the faith, as opposed to committed to the group, seek to counteract that prejudice and tribalism that may be indicated earlier. So I have become more aware of the way that theological parties, quite sophisticated ones, will nonetheless group together and speak about the others as if they're all the same. So I think there's something in it, anecdotally. Dawkins is also pressing the idea in The God Delusion that religion results from indoctrination. I think he has moved on from this a bit. But there's also interesting research suggesting that religious belief is natural. I'm just going to whip through this. There's the book. It's in my abstract and suggested reading. Justin Barrett at Oxford has talked about the hyperactive agency detection device. What this is about is that we seem to be prone to detect agency, purposeful activity out there in the world. Even in random arrangements and events, even when shapes are projected on a screen and move around, we'll start describing them in terms of chasing each other, escaping. And it may well be that this fits with an evolutionary story, because if you are inclined to see an agent out there when there isn't one, that probably won't do you much harm. So if you see a rock as a tiger, you'll quickly discover your mistake. But if you see a tiger as a rock, you're lunch. It also seems, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier about dualism doesn't seem to be a problem. The idea that there are souls and bodies didn't seem to generate much spontaneous questioning to me. In Descartes' Baby, Paul Bloom investigates and looks at the research evidence that suggests that our physical and mental aptitudes for understanding the world are distinct. So, for example, if we're on the Asperger's spectrum, we have difficulty relating to people and understanding emotions and empathising. But that doesn't correlate with a difficulty in understanding the physical world. And when you tell a story about brown mouse having various adventures and then being eaten by a crocodile, young children seem to understand that brown mouse's body is no longer functioning. So brown mouse doesn't need to eat anymore, he won't wake or sleep. But brown mouse still loves his mother. So brown mouse's thoughts and personality for children have a survival beyond the death of brown mouse's body. So it seems we're disposed to think in terms of an afterlife at childhood. And likewise, the idea that there are agents that you can't see seems to be intuitive, and this is why you may find more aggressive atheists accusing us of having imaginary friends and things. It's the same phenomenon. Children can have a very lively sense of an agent who can't be seen. And what's more, children seem to assume that everybody knows everything that they do in an unlimited way. And then as they grow up, they realise that other people don't know everything they do, and then they can use that as part of arts of deception and being naughty. But they start off by assuming that everybody knows everything. So the idea that God knows everything, that's where you start from. And the concepts of limited knowledge are acquired later. So an all-knowing God should be easy to grasp. We also have a tendency to see purpose in the world. Children seem to be disposed to see the world as a creation of a powerful agent. Even children who have atheistic parents who are offering natural explanations, when they're given a choice between natural and purposeful explanations, seem to prefer the purposeful ones. I'm whizzing through this, but you can read about it later. And one psychologist calls this intuitive theism, that belief that some sort of God is intuitive. There she is, performing ethical experiments on children with puppets. So, cash value in the parish. Many notions to do with God and an afterlife aren't indoctrination. They seem to spontaneously bubble up, but they do get culturally formed depending on which religion you're brought up in. These notions are readily and easily acquired and transmitted. So the sort of stories that religions deal with seem to have the features that are interesting, memorable, and make for being passed on. That's plausible too, as well. Good news, children seem to quite enjoy Bible stories. But doctrines like the Trinity require much more work to sustain. They're not intuitive in the same way, which Pascal Boyer calls the tragedy of the theologian. So welcome to the party. Should this undermine our belief in God? Well, I don't think so, because a belief can be true even if it has psychological causes. Some psychological causes certainly do undermine our confidence in a belief. But cognitive science of religion, CSR, hasn't shown our minds form more false beliefs about agents than true ones. It's not hyperactive in the sense of totally unreliable. We're able to weed out false and true beliefs, and God hasn't been weeded out so far. And that a belief has natural causes doesn't rule out it's being ultimately caused by God. So cognitive science of religion might even fit with belief, because it suggests that theistic explanations of the cosmos are intuitive. We are disposed to these personal why explanations, and if there are no more natural explanations, then there is still this personal explanation. It also might fit with claims that God makes himself plain through creation, if theism is intuitive. And it might help explain why all these buses go around saying there's probably no God, because if you already don't believe in God, then this does give you an explanation of why there are so many people who do. So it provides what the philosophers call an error theory. Does that make any sense? If lots of normal people seem to believe in God, that might dispose you to think, well, there must be something in it, until you have an error theory that explains why they believe that, even if there were no God. And the idea is our tendency to see agency is that story about why so many people are believing it. But just, again, to give you another anecdote, I was doing a funeral visit, quite an unchurched family, and spontaneously was told how this man who was a taxi driver had found himself spinning out of control on the motorway, having been struck by another car. And then suddenly he found himself in the slow lane, driving along safely. And he said, my mother was looking after me. This cognitive science of religion is meant to help explain why belief in ancestor spirits and other animistic spirits is so common. And so to have some awareness that this is intuitive, I think helped me, because coming from my highly university background, I might have at that point, you know, smiled wryly and thought this person's, you know, Stone Age. I confess that might have been how, but I didn't. I actually thought, no, I totally understand what you're talking about, but we're inclined to interpret significant events personalistically. Okay, we can discuss that. So, are there any questions of clarification? Are there any substantive questions about how I've got it all wrong?
Yeah, I mean, evidently, because you are a scientist, everything that you've presented has placed religion and science as if they're kind of competing on the same, what it called magisterial or whatever. And I think that this is a mistake, and this is a mistake of Dawkins, in fact, which you're just on the other side of. They're just not it's just not the same subject. They're not supposed to be answering the same questions in the same way. And Polkinghorne at the beginning explained some of these things. I think you just end up trying to answer from really you're eating into the secular way of thinking, and you're just going to end up with answers that have nothing to do with religion at all, like, well, it increases your health or it's better for this. That's not what religion's about. It's about not wanting those things at all.
Okay, I think that's an excellent question, and it's one of the discussion things.
Right.
And also, without wanting to be defensive, not everything I've said here is what I believe.
Right.
What I'm saying to you is this is how it might appear when you get out there. So I think that Dawkins has caught the mood correctly in putting it as a conflict. Now, of course, you've been offered other models. What I'm saying is, no, my experience out there is it's a conflict.
Well,
You may be able to offer a different account of that, but I think that is still where it's going to be. And part of the reason for that is that makes good media. And as I said, the media saturates the environment we're in. But if you want to say religion is about this and not that, then that's a scientific question as well. And we can go out and we can find out what religious believers do believe and count. Okay? So again, you're dealing with facts, and facts can be checked. I think I've said enough to, I hope, stimulate you to take part in the discussion and listen to.
Well, I think that you know, when you say things like facts, and you know, there are lots of different types of truth, and that would be an interesting path to go down to discuss, you know, what exactly you mean by facts, etc., which is, of course, in the philosophy of religion. But I think the debate would be much more interesting out there. Is actually people are very spiritual. It's not that, you know, the Dawkins debate is one debate, and I think if you would conceive that would be a start.
Yeah, and people are very spiritual, and what I'm saying is, be aware, science is offering perspectives on what that spirituality might involve and why that is pervasive. And as I said, you know, the sort of spirituality that you'll encounter out there may well involve ancestor spirits and things like that. But also, I just want to come back on this. The sort of facts that I'm saying we've got to deal with are questionnaires which ask people, what do you believe in? Are you interested in life, health and happiness? Do you believe in a virgin birth? Do you believe in the resurrection? Those are scientific questions that can be asked.
Those questions come from the secular, now, but they come from a secular point of view, and I don't think we want to buy into their questions.
Right, yeah.
I thought it was very interesting that you would start with the sort of observation that a conflict thesis between science and religion is very engaging. And I think your talk has been very engaging for me because you've continued a sort of conflict model between Christians and Christian thought and atheists, and I think maybe, I don't know, I'm slightly sort of riled like Catherine, maybe because of that, because actually I think the popular view of Christianity is that there is no internal criticism, and is also that Christians are only interested in the Bible, and that they don't, for example, have jobs, they don't, for example, engage in science. And I think that by portraying this in a sort of conflict model, we're sort of, I think we are in danger of treating the sort of challenges that cognitive research poses as if they are not Christian, as if they are outside of what God is doing, and also that we might misunderstand the atheist critique as if it is impossible that God might be using people like Richard Dawkins to call the church to repent of things that the church needs to repent of. So I'm sort of nervous of a conflict model which actually narrows down what God might be doing and makes it simple and engaging, but not true to the complexity of reality.
Yeah. Well, I am pleased if I've riled you, because that I'm hoping to promote questions in your mind and prepare you to go out there. And the research by Justin Barrett, he is a Christian. On the other hand, he would say himself, most people in this field are not. And some of the literature I've read, it was embarrassingly ignorant of basic facts. It was suggesting that the New Testament was written by shepherds, which shows the power of the nativity story, probably. But if I'm getting you to wake up and realise that that is out there, then you can start to prepare your response to that. But okay, I'll level you. My experience has been that people will smooth over and say there's no problem here, and that isn't my experience all the time. So I hope I'm a counterbalance and a corrective to all the wonderful people that you've had before. I'm being the bad boy of
It's in many ways with what the other two questioners have asked, and it applies to the whole of our 2.5 days, I think. Are we actually asking the wrong question, engaging in the wrong debate? I'm being deliberately provocative, I'm trying to be. Thinking of the lectionary earlier this week, when Jesus was asked by the temple authorities, by what authority do you do this? He actually said, the authority exists in the impact of my work, in the impact of John's work, in changed lives. The dead are raised, the sick are healed, the hungry are fed.
You're conflating two stories. He doesn't directly respond to the by what authority.
He doesn't directly, but
he
if you then
asks,
read, if you
by
then
what
sort of
authority
read on,
did John do it?
he then asks by what authority did John do it, and then he starts to talk about impact. And when John came to him several chapters earlier and said, are you the right person? He said, look at what's happening around you. Do we is the science debate the right one? Should we as a Christian community be more interested, and I think this really takes us to yesterday's work, in having the evidence to say whether you believe in the virgin birth, whether you get into the detail, look at the impact this faith is having on the community as a result of the fact that we believe it and are acting on it.
Right, and you're then able to appeal to the same sorts of consideration perhaps in a more anecdotal way that are being appealed to by Myers in the health studies and the activity. And I think that is very persuasive, and I've found my congregation are actually encouraged and consoled, and some of them were very disturbed, because they thought, no, that seems right. Northern Ireland, it does seem appalling, and I do worry that religion is making it worse. And so if we can point to an impact which is positive, at the very least, we can say that Dawkins is taking a very biased view of the evidence, and that, you know, that, again, that is out there. And another thing I'd perhaps just say to be provocative, I got quite a lot about the need to be a theologian embedded in my community in my training. But as I have gone out in the parish, I've been seeing my role as a minister to the whole community. And so what the Christian community and the wider community are believing does seem to me to involve quite a gap. I mean, there's huge variety. It's very difficult to be general, but that has made me wonder whether if we focus on our community, we're focusing on quite a small group with our own concerns, but there are important questions that are coming from without of that. And at the moment, we're still privileged to have all these assemblies and things. But that may not be the case. And you know, when I arrived in Norwich, Dr. Ian Gibson was trying to stop the formation of an academy because it had religious input from it. So, you know, these were being fought in the community around me. At the back.
I suppose two slightly separate points. The first one, you talked about methodical naturalism, and you talked about things like multiverse. Do you think that is actually not science anymore? Because yes, there is a methodical approach there, but if we cannot ever make predictions that we can test, if we can't get results, then surely that's missing out. Surely that's saying science can answer everything. But actually there is a limit to science, and science can't address those questions that we can't ever test to see if they're true. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is more along the points of, as opposed to looking for science to dig down into the core beliefs of religion, maybe we can flip the argument on the head and see if religion can try to look at actually almost the philosophies of science. By this I mean, yes, we have a faith. We believe that actually, going back to that taxi philosopher, that the book stops here. But so do they. So do scientists, also we as scientists believe that, because there comes an element in every scientist's life that he does have faith in something, be it logic, be it in the fact that laws of physics are the same everywhere in the universe, which we cannot test. There is a faith in science, and as opposed to allowing science to tap away at our fundamental beliefs, surely we can ask the same questions of religion.
Yeah, I mean, taking the second question first, that would be very much my approach, but you need to be aware that there is a question there. Where are you going to stop, and what's your reason for waving the taxi away at that point? And you know, I don't think any of us are going to make much of a fist of life if we wave away the taxi saying, and I'm going to have no faith in empirical data or logic at all. Yeah. So, you know, there are going to be some stopping points, but there's still a question we've got to answer: why are you stopping with God? Obviously, I wasn't brought in as the expert on philosophy of science or multiverses. So, as I say, I'm here to provoke awareness. What I'm saying about methodological naturalism is, I think it's in the background of a lot of these discussions, and we've got to take seriously the fact that there are our congregation who, even if they are highly relativistic and seem to believe in very different things from your average science professor, have bought into iPods, technology that depends on quantum understandings. You know, this method works, and it's going to be given a run for its money by people not without reason, not arbitrarily, not dogmatically, but because it's succeeded so much in the past. And we need to be aware of that. I don't want to answer the question about where to start. I want you to think, but am I ignoring the fact that we've got a technique here that has been so successful? That's what I wanted to provoke, yeah, at the front.
I was coming from an Italian background. I was thinking that sometimes I saw in the Italian situation, sometimes people coming from outside the communities are trying to stress the fact that the truth of our religion is not true, because and trying to engage a great debate starting from ethic issues. And I was wondering if it's the same here in your experience, because sometimes there is this kind of approach. You are acting as you have the truth, and you are good. Your idea are the best idea, but your idea then create this kind of situation by which I'm not free to live as I want, or as I can. And so I show you that your truth is not real, is not so that the main point by which you can show me your better position to judge me and to try to create a sort of better way in which you can it's not true. So I was wondering if in this kind of debate on truth there is something that comes from even an ethic issues, a sort of Christian behavior to outside the communities and so on.
Yeah, I think so. That, again, my ability to comment on cultural trends in the UK is limited, and I just want to emphasise how anecdotal this has got to be, because I just haven't done any research at all. But I have had experiences that would certainly suggest that the way we live makes a difference. Some people do seem to be threatened and fearful that the church is going to take political power. And, you know, I think arguments about places like Saudi Arabia or Northern Ireland are brought in because you can see that the church and political power are closely linked. And I imagine that that's an issue in Italy as well. But I think that, you know, the new atheists are out there and they're writing best-selling books, which, as I say, are being read by retired clergy with effect. And so they're linking, they are quite ethical in their own way. What sort of ethics you get from naturalism is an interesting philosophical question. But I think it is there, and we can appeal to good things, but there are problems too. And I suppose, for what it's worth, here with my science religion hat on, science has something to say about this, is all I want to say. But I think there are huge cultural questions that are going far beyond it, and science is only one part of that. Oh, you've had a go.
I feel quite worried by this idea about the taxi cab and how much we subject the mind of God to questioning. And I just wanted to raise the banner for humility, really, because, you know, God's thoughts are not our thoughts and His ways are not our ways. And I think as soon as we feel like, because science in some sense has pervaded the world in which we live, it also has to pervade our faith in Jesus and the way that we understand or don't understand God. I think it's quite a dangerous position to take, because how much can we know about the mind of God, and what are we saying about our own intellectual ability to understand God's mind? You know what? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, no, you made the point brilliantly, and this is very current and totally in touch with a real streams of piety and faith. And Schopenhauer, in fact, wasn't a naturalist as we would understand. He wasn't Dawkins. He was interested in Eastern religion. What I think I'd say is there is a tradition that we're not going into this for the first time, and this tradition goes through people like St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, who were neither fools nor impious, but they recognised that we have to say this rather than saying nothing at all. Now, interestingly, Hume's dialogue has several partners of the discussion, and Philo attacks one of them, and he might be seen as the sort of science religion guy who's offering a natural theology based on all the wonders of creation. And Hume's character attacks him on the basis, well, you've just pushed the question back into what explains the order in the mind of God. But there's another approach which is much more mystical and humble, and Hume's character there says, but you're just left with agnostic mysticism. What's the difference between you and atheism? And I think if there's a taxi cab objection that waves away the quest for explanation, there's probably a parallel objection which says, you Christians, you're all humble about God when it suits you and the hard questions are being asked, and then you tell us that God loves us, that he intervenes for our prayers, that he raised Jesus from the dead, that he's going to give us a wonderful afterlife, and you're prepared to reason about that and trust that. If you were as sceptical and agnostic about all the sort of everyday parts of your faith, you'd be like we are. You'd be a nice person, humanistic, but you'd be more honest that you don't really believe in God as a fact. You're an agnostic with some spiritual corona around it. I think that's the challenge.
Do you believe in miracles, and how do you would you say that they occur within the laws of nature or outside of it?
I do believe in miracles. I believe in the resurrection as a foundational event. If I ceased to believe in the resurrection, it would produce tectonic changes in my whole Christian faith. The question about natural laws is a harder one, and of course that wasn't the way it could have been expressed at the time those stories were being written, but they clearly thought there was some sort of new creation going on, that something radically different had happened, in the case of Jesus for the first time. I remember being young and doing English, and we were being offered parallels from other bits of literature and doing Shakespeare, and I thought, this is all a bit far-fetched, isn't it? And it's been interesting to me, just as a reader of text, to become more aware of intertextuality and allusion and things like that. And so I would now read the Bible and recognise that the miracle stories in the Gospels, they are using language, sometimes exact words, from the Old Testament. So, we talked about John the Baptist, the language there drawing on Isaiah, John the Baptist drawing on traditions about Elijah and things like that. So I would now have a much more literary awareness and see that there's much more in literary readings of these stories. So, I was asked by the Norwich Humanist Society, do you believe in the virgin birth then? And I said I do, but I don't see that as foundational in the way that I see the resurrection. I only can believe in the virgin birth because I believe these other things. And if it were proved to me that the virgin birth was a metaphor, that wouldn't, be such a big change for me. But again, I say I'm not here to tell you what I believe. I'm here to help you in a way that I didn't, to encounter religion and spirituality and non-spirituality and atheism in the wild, out there in the parish. And that, I want to provoke you to think, how am I going to deal with these things at the back?
You mentioned a few times the distinction between sound bites and seminars, so to speak. And I just wondered, thinking about engaging apologetically with atheists or agnostics, how you find an integrity between persuasion and sort of explanation and setting out the full nuanced argument on a particular issue, or seeking to use your knowledge, your understanding as more of a persuasion apologetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a judgment call, and as I say, you've got to try and get some idea of where people are coming from. You often don't have time to have the sort of dialogue to see what their issues are. As a curate, I had an awful experience when I was talking to someone, and I came out with a sort of apologetic soundbite, and suddenly realised that they were an expert on patristics, and I had to backpedal, and I had to sort of recognise that I was saying something that I knew wasn't true. That I'd pedalled something that was too fast. But at the same time, I've become aware in schools, children will say, that we've been told things that aren't true, or they lied to us, and I think, no, that was a simplification. So, finding the right line is very difficult, and I remember doing A-level chemistry and physics, and when we learned about quantum mechanics, feeling, yes, we've been lied to. So the educational task is one that will lay you open to some hard questions about integrity. But if you can get a dialogue, that's far better. But a soundbite can be better than nothing, perhaps, and that would be mine.
Patrick, I think you really have provoked them. I think you've slightly eaten in and beyond the discussion group time, because you've really raised an awful lot of issues, which has obviously stimulated this great discussion. But I think we're well into coffee time, so I think we have to draw close and give a big round of applause. Thank you.